Folk Tales Sketchbook.
What if the one thing you traded away for a quick profit was the only thing keeping you alive? Every single day, people smile at your face, shake your hand, and swear on everything they love, then vanish the moment a better deal walks through the door. We call it networking. We call it strategy. The old ones had a different name for it. This is the story of a man who found out exactly what that name meant. There was a time, not so long ago by the measure of mountains, when a young hunter named Kiona was considered the sharpest mind in all the valley settlements, and not a single soul who said so meant it as a compliment. Kiona had a tongue that moved faster than a hawk in a dive, and eyes that were always scanning the room for whoever had the fullest plate. He was not cruel in the way that makes people flinch when you walk past. He was charming, actually, the kind of charming that makes you feel chosen, special, like you are the one person he has decided to trust with his inner circle, right up until the moment a better inner circle becomes available and you realize you were never really inside it at all. He had a habit, well known and widely discussed around every fire in the settlement, of joining a hunting party with great enthusiasm, slapping backs, promising to share every piece of the kill equally, and then, the moment a deer was spotted in a direction different from the group, he would peel off silently and take the prize for himself, returning to camp with a full pack and an explanation so elaborate and convincing that half the group almost believed him. Almost. He had done this so many times that the younger hunters had begun using his name as a verb. "Do not pull a Kiona on me," they would warn each other before setting out. He found this hysterical. He wore it like a badge. When the elders of the settlement gathered to speak about the concept of sacred trust, which they did with great seriousness and much ceremony, Kiona would sit at the edge of the circle with a half-smile pulling at the corner of his mouth, nodding along the way a man nods when someone explains a road he has already decided not to take. "Sacred trust," he told his younger cousin once, leaning back with his arms crossed and that smile fully deployed, "is what people with nothing to offer call the reason you should stay loyal to them. It is a chain they want to put around your wrist and call it a bracelet." His cousin had looked uncomfortable. Kiona had laughed and changed the subject. He genuinely believed this. That was not the performance. The performance was the nodding in the elder circle. The belief was the laugh by the fire, the easy certainty that the world was made of transactions, and the only question worth asking was whether you were the buyer or the seller in any given moment. He had grown up watching men honor their word and lose their season's hunt to a late frost anyway, and he had drawn from this the conclusion that the universe did not reward loyalty, so why should he? He shifted his alliances the way water shifts around a stone, always finding the lowest path, always arriving somewhere useful, always moving. The settlement tolerated him because he was genuinely skilled. He could track, he could run, he could read the sky in ways that made older hunters shake their heads with reluctant admiration. His gifts were real, his promises were decorative, and for a long time, the valley was generous enough that this arrangement cost him nothing. Then the sky forgot how to give. It happened over several weeks, so gradually that the first signs were easy to dismiss. A stream running thinner than usual, the reeds along the bank going yellow at the tips, the animals shifting their patterns in ways that the careful observers among the tribe noted quietly and with growing concern. By the time the main river dropped to a series of brown, disconnected pools sitting in cracked mud, there was nothing left to dismiss. The drought was total, and it was serious, and it had settled over the valley like a guest who had no intention of leaving. The settlement's water stores, which had never been built to last more than a few weeks because the river had always been reliable, dropped fast. Children were given priority and still went thirsty by afternoon. The elders called councils. People argued about where to move, whether to move, what to ask the sky for, and how to ask it. The fear in the camp was quiet and deep, which is the worst kind of fear, the kind that does not shout, but simply sits beside you at every meal. Kiona, to his credit, was not idle during this time. He was not the kind of man who sat in fear. He was the kind of man who went looking for an angle. He set out alone into the back canyons, the deep-cut places in the rock that most hunters avoided because the terrain was punishing and the game was scarce. And he went with the specific intention of finding water before anyone else did, because water, in a drought of this scale, was the most valuable thing in the world, and Kiona had never once encountered something of great value without immediately calculating what he could get for it. He pushed deeper than he had ever gone, through passages so narrow his shoulders scraped both walls, down into a bowl-shaped depression hidden between two massive formations of red stone. And there, in the silence of that hidden place, he found it. A spring. Crystal clear, impossibly clear, cold in a way that felt intentional, fed by something deep in the earth that the drought had not reached, and apparently could not reach. The water moved and caught the light, and seemed almost to hum with a quality that was difficult to name, but impossible to ignore. Kiona dropped to his knees because his legs gave out, not from reverence but from thirst and exhaustion, and the sudden overwhelming proximity of exactly what he needed. And then a presence settled over the canyon like a change in temperature, and a voice came from everywhere and nowhere, ancient and smooth as water-worn stone, and Kiona, who prided himself on being afraid of nothing, went very still. The spirit did not arrive with fury or spectacle. It was simply present, the way deep water is present beneath the surface of a still pool, felt before seen, understood before explained. It spoke with the patience of something that had existed long before Kiona's great-grandmother's great-grandmother had drawn her first breath, and it said, without accusation or warmth, simply as a statement of fact, that it knew what Kiona was. Kiona, still on his knees, said nothing, which was unusual for him. The spirit told him that the spring was sacred, that it had sustained this valley through every drought in living memory and beyond, that its waters were a gift belonging to all people and all creatures of the land, not a commodity to be measured into waterskins and exchanged for personal gain. It told him that the honest and the humble were always welcome at this water. Then it extended what it called a covenant. Kiona could drink. He could save himself. He could return to his settlement and lead his people here, every man, woman, and child, and the spring would give freely to all of them for as long as the drought lasted. The only condition, the spirit said, was this: he must take the white shell, a small, perfect shell that appeared in the spirit's open palm as if it had always been there, and he must swear upon it never to sell this water, never to use it as a tool of power over others, never to trade its location for personal wealth. The shell would remember the oath, even when a man's own mind chose to forget. Kiona looked at the shell. He looked at the water. He was profoundly thirsty and profoundly practical, and the oath, in the context of his immediate desperation, seemed like a very small price. He reached out and took the shell in both hands, and he swore. He used the right words. He meant approximately none of them. The spirit said nothing more. The water stayed clear. Kiona drank, and the cold of it went all the way through him, and for just a moment, something in the temperature of the spring made him feel that the oath he had spoken had gone somewhere real, somewhere that would hold it long after he had filed it away under things to revisit later, and then deliberately never revisited. He tucked the shell into his pack. He told himself it was decorative. He was already calculating. He walked back into the settlement as the sun was going down, and he saw immediately what he had suspected from the moment he found the spring. The desperation was complete. People were gathered around the last muddy pool of what had been the river, debating whether it was safe to drink. Children were quiet in a way that meant they were beyond complaining. Old men were looking at the sky with expressions that had moved past prayer into something harder and more tired. Kiona stood at the edge of the settlement and looked at all of this and felt, rising inside him with the ease of a habit, the familiar calculation. He had the location of the only clean water within a day's walk. These people needed water more than they had ever needed anything. The gap between those two facts was a business opportunity of extraordinary proportions, and Kiona, who had spent his entire life believing that every gap was a bridge to be monetized, walked straight across it. He did not lead anyone to the spring. He went back to it alone, under cover of darkness, filled every water skin and container he owned, and returned to the settlement at dawn with what appeared to be a generous supply. He stood in the center of the camp and announced that he had found water and that he would share it, and the look of relief on the faces around him was something he absorbed and did not feel. The price was straightforward: a fine hunting knife for a single full water skin, 2 worked furs for a double portion. The turquoise bracelet that old Marta had worn for 40 years went for a half canteen. He told them the supply was limited, which was a lie, But the lie was structurally useful because scarcity drove urgency, and urgency removed negotiation. Within 2 days, he had accumulated more material wealth than he had gathered in the previous 3 years combined. He sat in his shelter surrounded by stacked furs and traded weapons and small items of jewelry, and he felt a deep and uncomplicated satisfaction, the specific pleasure of a man who believes he has understood how the world works and proven it with results. The white shell sat at the bottom of his pack. He did not take it out. He had, by this point, almost entirely stopped thinking about it. Wealth has a quality that most people do not anticipate until they have accumulated enough of it, which is that it creates its own hunger, a specific appetite not for more of the same thing, but for a larger category of the same feeling, the sense of having won, of being ahead, of standing on ground that everyone else has to look up to reach. Kiona had felt it before in smaller doses, the quiet pleasure of being the one with the full pack while others went without. But now, surrounded by real accumulation, the feeling had grown into something with dimensions and direction, and it was pointing him toward a larger move. He had heard, from the traders who passed through the valley even in drought years, that the Hawk Ridge tribe across the mountain was wealthy in the way that settlements became wealthy when they controlled a trade route. They had horses, they had gold, they had enough surplus that they occasionally bought information rather than things, because information, to a powerful tribe in a dry year, could be worth more than any physical goods. Kiona went to see them on the 4th night after his return, alone, moving through the high pass in the dark, which told you something about how clearly he was thinking, or how little he was thinking about the spirit and the oath and the shell. He met with the Hawk Ridge traders in a camp below the summit, and he presented his offer with the confidence of a man who believes he holds every card in the hand. He had the exact location of a spring that had never run dry, hidden in a canyon that no one else knew, producing clean, cold water in the middle of the worst drought in living memory. He described it in precise detail. He drew the path in the dirt. He named his price, 50 horses and 3 baskets of gold, delivered before he showed them the entrance to the canyon. They agreed without negotiating, which should have told him something, but the sound of 50 horses was very loud inside his head and left little room for the quieter signals. He walked home through the pass as the sun came up, feeling for the first time in his life like a man who had found the correct scale for his ambitions. He led them to the canyon on the following morning, the Hawk Ridge traders and their heavily armed escort, a procession that moved through the narrow passage in single file. Kiona at the front with the long, easy stride of a man arriving at his own triumph. He could feel the gold in the baskets behind him and the weight of 50 horses waiting at the canyon entrance as a physical warmth at his back. He had not brought anyone from his own settlement. He had not said goodbye. His plan, such as it was to collect the payment, walk north, and begin a new life in a place where no one knew his name, or his history, or his pattern with promises. The canyon opened up, and there was the spring, exactly as he had left it, clear and cold and perfect, catching the morning light in a way that made several of the Hawk Ridge men exhale slowly and reach forward as if to touch something they did not entirely believe was real. Kiona stopped at the water's edge and turned to face the empty air above the spring, because some part of him knew the spirit was there, and what he felt in that moment was not guilt and not fear, but a specific kind of contempt, the contempt of a man who has decided that the rules belong to a world he has already left. He spread his arms and said it plainly, with the full weight of his accumulated confidence. The oath meant nothing, the spirit meant nothing, and the gold behind him was the only truth that mattered in the world he actually lived in. He bent down to the water, he cupped his hands, he touched the surface. The spring answered, not slowly, instantly. The crystal water went black from the bottom up, a rising dark that had heat behind it. And then the ground opened and the spring erupted in a column of thick, scalding, adhesive black mud that took Kiona completely and swallowed his hands and his arms up to the elbow and connected him, with tremendous and immediate certainty, to the gold-weighted sacks he was still gripping. And the mud hardened around him like a judgment that had always been waiting for exactly this moment to become permanent. The eruption was not small. It coated the canyon walls and the assembled Hawk Ridge escort, and filled the air with the smell of deep earth and something older than earth. And when it settled, the spring was simply gone, replaced by a depression of cracked, gray, cooling mud, and Kiona was in the center of it, hands fused to his sacks of gold by a layer of hardened black crust that was not giving under any amount of pulling. The Hawkridge men stood in silence for a moment. They had ridden over a mountain for water. They were looking at a mud hole. A man had sold them a mud hole. They were not a patient or forgiving community under the best circumstances, and this was not the best circumstances, and the circumstances were deteriorating further because several of them were coated in mud, and one of them had lost a boot in the initial eruption, and was now hopping on one foot in a way that had transformed his mood from mercenary to genuinely murderous. The negotiation that followed was brief. They assessed the situation. They determined that they had been cheated. They retrieved the 50 horses from the canyon entrance, which was straightforward because the horses were right there. The gold in the baskets Kiona was not holding, they removed from around him with efficient contempt. The gold in the sacks he was attached to, they decided was not worth the effort of extraction and left him to it. Several men expressed their opinion of the arrangement in physical terms before departing, which was thorough and unambiguous. They left him face down in the cooling mud, wrists sealed to the sacks, which were themselves half submerged, so that the gold that had been the architecture of his entire new future was now an anchor holding him in place in the gray remains of a sacred spring he had sold and destroyed. And the weight of it was, in every sense that mattered, exactly what he had been working toward. The smoke from the geyser had been visible across the valley, and the wise chief of Kiona's settlement had followed it with several of the elders and most of the tribe behind them, because smoke in the canyon country during a drought had the quality of a message that cannot be ignored. They arrived in the canyon to find Kiona in the mud. They found the cracked gray depression where the spring had been. Then one of the elders knelt at the edge of the depression and touched the ground with one hand, very quietly, and said something in the old language that no one translated, but everyone understood from the sound of it. And the spring came back. It came back clear. It came back cold. It came back from whatever depth had always held it, flowing freely through the crust of gray mud, finding its own surface, offering itself to honest hands without condition or price. The tribe drank. Children drank first. No one charged anyone. The spring gave until every person was satisfied, and kept giving because it had always been built to keep giving, and its only limit had ever been the conscience of the people who found it. Kiona watched all of this from the mud. He watched his settlement drink freely from the water he had been rationing by the knife and the bracelet. He watched the elders accept it as a gift. He watched the children's faces change when the water reached them. He was not able to stand, and his gold was not able to help him, and his reputation, which had been the currency he had been trading on his entire adult life, the reputation of a man who was sharp enough to work every angle, was now a story the whole tribe had just finished watching write its final paragraph. Grandpa Nasuba pauses here, lets the fire do the talking for a moment, and then he looks directly at you. "You know what the funniest part is?" he says. "He could have just brought them to the spring for free. He would have been a hero for 10 generations. Instead, he chose 48 hours of being the richest man in a thirsty camp, and he traded a legacy for a mud bath." He taps the side of his head. "Every week I see people do this. They ghost the friends who helped them get started because a wealthier contact came along. They sell the loyalty of people who trusted them for a deal that falls apart in a month. And then they sit in their own version of that mud, holding gold they cannot spend, in a reputation they cannot clean, wondering where everything went." He looks back at the fire. Kiona sat in that mud for a long time, long enough to understand that the weight pulling him down was not the gold. It was every promise he had made and thrown away. The gold was just helping him feel it properly. He goes quiet. The fire settles. The sacred spring was never really about water. It was a mirror. It showed every person who came to it exactly what they had decided to be, and it responded accordingly. Kiona was not destroyed by the spirit's punishment. He was destroyed by the architecture of his own choices, built promise by broken promise into something that could only hold his weight for so long before it gave way entirely. The real lesson is this: trust, once it becomes a tool you use rather than a truth you live, stops being trust and becomes a trap you set for yourself. Every shortcut through someone else's faith in you costs more than it earns, and the bill always arrives at the worst possible time, in front of the people whose opinion you can no longer afford to lose. The world will always have droughts. What saves communities is never the man who found the water and charged for it. It is always the one who led people there and stood aside. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have not yet become part of this fire circle, now would be a very good time to subscribe, because the old ones have a great deal more to say, and they are just getting started.
Folk Tales Sketchbook.